Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another fun-filled lecture with me. Today we are starting a brand new unit. This is, one of the more interesting units that we've probably been over. This one is called A World Reborn. So this picks up right at the end of the Middle Ages. This is when parts of Europe start to regain the knowledge that they were given previously. So we'll cover four different topics in this unit: the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, exploration, and absolutism. So let's get at it. So, if you want to really understand what the Renaissance is, it really means rebirth. Like Renaissance is literally Italian for rebirth. Because remember, when we were talking about the Middle Ages in Unit 3, when we were looking at specifically Europe, it was called the Dark Ages because everything was extinguished, all the lights. All the lights of learning had went out. You had disease, you had chaos, you had war, trade routes crossing Italian city-states on the way to the Crusades in Jerusalem allowed for all this old world knowledge to start flowing back in along with money. And that's when people began to question the authority of the church. And then, of course, you have the Black Death, which killed half of the people living at that time. So people could, ask for their freedom or demand their freedom or be paid for their work. And then, of course, you have the 100 Years' War. And after that, people were like, okay, we've had enough of this. So we pick up right when you're going through the Crusades and the Black Death and the 100 Years' War in the rest of Europe. But the Renaissance really starts in Italy. So from 1350 to about 1500, we refer to this time as the Italian Renaissance. So Renaissance is rebirth, as I told you. I think I misspoke. I meant French and not Italian. This was basically just the time period where you began to look back on the Greek and Roman times for inspiration. And it does begin in Italy, and then eventually it spreads north to the rest of Europe. And that's called the Northern Renaissance, we'll get to in a bit. So before, during the Middle Ages, people fled the cities. Now you see people coming back to these cities and giving these cities way more power. They start to urbanize once again. They also have a more secular outlook on life, a non-religious outlook. And they emphasize human ability. So there's this high regard for individual accomplishments, which we will look at the Italian artists, which are arguably all Renaissance men. So where this really begins are in three different states or cities. You have Milan, Venice, and Florence. They would become the most powerful Italian cities during this time. Venice, the reason why they gained so much power is because they traded all over the Mediterranean. Venice is literally a city on water. And Florence was the banking capital of the Italian Renaissance, thanks to the de' Medici family. They established one of the largest and most profitable banks, and at one point in time, the Medici family was the bank of the Catholic Church and of Rome. So it really became a cultural center because Lorenzo de' Medici would actually use his money to become a patron of the arts. So he paid people to do nothing but make art. And he is the reason why we know who Leonardo da Vinci is today, which we'll look at that later. One of the other aspects that actually starts to grow during this time is this idea of humanism. It's the emphasis on human intellect and capability. So there was this guy named Petrarch who was the father of the Renaissance and the father of Renaissance humanism. And he basically understood that as humans, we have a capacity to know a lot of different things. So he argued that people need to be educated in the humanities, which is literature, history, and art. It's the reason why you take English class and history classes along with math and science. It's to create this well-rounded individual in hopes that you may become a Renaissance person. Because a Renaissance person is someone who is very skilled in history, in politics, in literature, in engineering, in math and science, and so on and so forth. This is Leonardo da Vinci. We'll get to him a little bit later. So one of the most well-known people to come out of this time that you probably have never heard of is Niccolo Machiavelli. And Machiavelli was a politician in Florence. He actually worked very closely with the Medici family, and he lost favor with the Medici family, and as a result, he was exiled because of it. But he wanted to return because Florence was his whole life. So he wrote a book about statecraft that was dedicated to the Medici family. It was supposed to pay homage to this family that he deeply respected. And so it was called The Prince. And it was basically how a ruler should gain power and how they keep power. Machiavelli actually believed that in order to be a good leader, you should be amoral, which means that you should be more about the individual than you are about taking care of people. You rule over cities regardless of whether or not it's morally right or wrong. So a piece from this says that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few really know what you are. Right? So this is Machiavelli explaining that appearances are more important with leadership than what you actually do. Modern leaders actually today in politics, you call this being Machiavellian, where you appear to be one thing, but behind closed doors, you do another. It's actually a very interesting concept when it comes to politics and political science that maybe you will go on to learn a little bit more about. Now, as you could imagine, the Medici family didn't take this very lightly. They were basically, he wrote a book basically saying that you should be immoral because that's how good leaders need to be. And because the Medici family had a reputation to uphold, they were very offended by it. So Machiavelli never actually returned to Florence. So let's go back to art for a second. During the medieval ages, art was very flat. It also had a lot of symbolism. It was probably, religious in some manner. So as you see here, these are all art pieces taken from the Middle Ages. They are all religious in nature and they all look really weird. Things change with Renaissance art because you have the development of perspectives. So instead of creating a flat surface, you are now looking for the 3 dimensions. They use geometry to be able to do this, to accurately show distance and light and space, that perspective that we know that as you're looking at something, it appears to get smaller farther away, like further you go. So they studied the anatomy of figures to create this very realistic image. And then you also have Brunelleschi, who used geometry and engineering to create a church called the Duomo. It's a cathedral, massive cathedral in Florence, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. And Brunelleschi was an architect that was hired by the Medici family to create the Duomo because they wanted a lasting legacy. Machiavelli wasn't very wrong about the Medici family, just saying. Brunelleschi designed this church more for human worship rather than God being worshipped. So they basically built it for egotistical purposes, narcissism. It's awesome. So this is an image. This is a Renaissance painting. So this is done by Raphael. It's called the School of Athens, and it shows perspective. So if you look at the 3 arches, you've got this one here, and then you've got this one, you've got this one, and this one. These are the same, but they are smaller because they are going further away, and they also don't look flat. There is shading, and if you look at the people, they look rounded rather than flat. So yeah, They get pretty sophisticated with it. So this is the image of Brunelleschi's dome, or the Duomo, in Florence. The church was built in the 1200s, but Brunelleschi was actually the one to add the dome. And it has 2 layers in it. And that's when they figured out how to actually create the dome. Because before it would be like an infill thing. Until the 1400s, there was no dome, so this was not here. It took that long for the Medici family to find an architect who could create the dome. And there's actually 2 layers. This is an active piece because they have engineering. If you want to know more about it, I can talk to you about it because I did a project on this in architecture school. So some of the other Renaissance artists of this time, they're basically all of the Ninja Turtles. Leo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello. Leonardo is considered to be one of the most well-known and probably the Renaissance man of the period. He was a painter. He dissected bodies and to study human anatomy to become a better painter. He was an inventor. He was a poet, and he was a philosopher. The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa are probably the 2 most famous paintings by Leonardo that are out there today. His journals, which you can see just from a simple Google search, actually show his study of like the anatomical man and building the first helicopter. So he's a pretty cool dude, If you're wondering who it is, this is Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello down here. Michelangelo was a painter and a sculptor and an architect. He actually completed the Sistine Chapel, which is at the Vatican in Rome, and he did it by laying on his back and painting. I have a picture of it. I'll show you. He also created the sculpture of David in perfect proportions. This is on display at the Louvre in Paris, if you ever get the chance to go. Then you have Raphael, who painted the Madonna and Child. He also painted the School of Athens that shows the balance and harmony of order, as you all saw. And then you have Donatello, who is a very famous sculptor because he sculpted his creations to look extremely realistic and also, again, had the perfect proportions. So now let's move into the Northern Renaissance. So you have the Italian Renaissance that brings back, learning and inventing and creating and being more secular. And then this starts to spread out. So it spreads to the north. And it spreads through trade, and it is obviously also centered in larger cities. So some of the aspects of the Northern Renaissance, you have Christian humanism, which merges the idea of the human learning with a Christian focus. You also started to see things being painted on a smaller scale. There was an attention to detail that used to create realistic pictures. They were not just perspective. It also focused on reality or Christianity and not mythology. 2 of the famous artists from the Northern Renaissance are Jane van Eyck and then Albert Dürer. Yeah, say that one. Yeah. You also have the printing press that emerges thanks to Johann Gutenberg. Printing made things easier, cheaper, and faster. More people could afford books. More people started to learn how to read, which led to being more educated and definitely questioning the Catholic Church on their practices because now people could have individual Bibles. It was actually one of the first things that was printed on the printing press. If you ever hear about the Gutenberg Bibles, those are very famous Bibles because they were the first things printed on the Gutenberg printing press. Pretty cool. You also have the emergence of what's called vernacular literature. So vernacular is the language that we speak. It's the language of a specific area. Writing became popular in vernacular instead of Latin because more people could read the vernacular versus the Latin. So more people could read in French and more people could read in German. So they started printing and writing and making things in these specific languages. So how do you think that affects the church's influence? Well, the church's influence started to plummet and explode. Basically, what the vernacular started to do was it helped codify languages. This is where we start to see the emergence of Italian and Spanish and French and German and Polish and Russian, like individual specific languages. Two main writers that came out of this vernacular literature time period was Dante, who was Italian, Dante Alighieri. He wrote the Divine Comedy, which is really interesting. You also have Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales in English. And then in the late Renaissance, you have the emergence of William Shakespeare in England. So I'm going backwards. So Dante Alighieri's Inferno in the Divine Comedy is all about the soul's journey to foundation or to salvation. So this is where you see humanism meeting Christian beliefs. So there are three different sections to this journey. There's hell, there's purgatory, and then there's heaven. And in each of these, this is where we get the 7 layers of hell kind of saying. It's because Dante Alighieri actually wrote in the Inferno and the Divine Comedy that there are 7 different layers of hell, and then you have purgatory, which is a place that you just go and hang out until you can be judged. It's like jail, it's like a waiting room before hell comes along and or heaven. And then obviously you have heaven. Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales is probably one of my most favorites. I can actually, in my English 4 class in high school, we read the Canterbury Tales. Now, the Canterbury Tales is not complete. It is about a pilgrimage that goes to Canterbury, where Thomas Becket was killed by King Henry of England. Thomas Becket was the king's cousin. I believe cousin, brother. I forgot all of a sudden. Dang it. I just was just refreshing myself. Anyway, so the king said something to his guards, and the guards took it upon themselves to go kill Thomas Becket, who was a father. He was a priest, bishop in the Catholic Church, and he was in the middle of giving service when they ran in and they killed him on the steps. Yikes. Anyway, so the Canterbury Tales is not completed. It basically features stories of each individual person who's trying to make this pilgrimage to Canterbury. When I was in high school, we had to memorize the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. It is pretty incredible, pretty insane if you say me, because I can actually still remember it. Sorry about that. Okay. So why is this thing? Sorry about that. Everything kind of went crazy for a second, so I had to pause. So yeah, I had to learn the prologue in Old English. One that April with the shores of Shuta, the droot of March hath perched to the root. Yeah, I could keep going. I'm not going to. It's pretty insane. I really hope y'all don't have to do that anymore because it's actually kind of interesting. And then you have Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is very well known for plays like Romeo and Juliet, for Hamlet, so on and so forth. He is arguably the best playwright ever, and he uses themes of humanity. He moved away from moral plays in the Middle Ages and started to talk about things that people wanted to talk about. his best known plays are Macbeth, which, if you are in theater, you can't really say, especially when you are about to go on stage, because bad things will happen. Ask me about that later. Um, and Macbeth is basically just a man and his wife craving power. Then you have Hamlet, the drama king, is basically a prince who keeps seeing the ghost of his father because, spoiler alert, he kills him and now he's being haunted. And then, of course, you have Romeo and Juliet, which is a forbidden love story. Um, and we keep making this film over and over and over and over again in many different forms. There have been many adaptations of Shakespeare throughout the age.